There are places where science ends and darkness begins, where reality fractures and nightmares breathe. These are the tales of Carl Otto's dark anthology. Whistleback by Carl Otto. The dogs refused to cross the threshold. He stood at the base of the cracked stone steps, keys clutched in one hand, leashes taut in the other. The mutt, short, red-eyed, half muscle, half bark, planted her feet like a mule, claws carving furrows in the dirt. The shepherd trembled, a soft whine caught in his throat, tail stiff as a steel rod. He gave them a little tug, gentle enough not to hurt. They'd been his shadows for years, his guardians, his friends. Even when things were at their worst, they'd always stayed close. Not now. He crouched beside them, running a hand through the shepherd's fur. The mutt leaned into him for a moment before retreating. Her nose pointed toward the woods, her growl low and steady. He didn't need them to explain. They knew something wasn't right here. They could feel it in the air. The air smelled like pine, iron, and mildew. It wasn't just the old, unlived-in kind of mildew. It was something deeper, colder, like wet stone in a cave you shouldn't have found. He loosened his grip on the leashes, gave them one last reassuring pat, and stepped inside alone. At first they hung back, wary, tails low. But as he reached the doorway, the shepherd crept forward, then the mutt, both moving slowly as if the air itself weighed them down. By the time he crossed the threshold, they were at his side again, their eyes scanning the shadows. No birdsong. That was the first thing he noticed. Just the faint sound of the wind rolling off the woods behind the house. The dogs let out a single sharp bark. They'd followed him in, reluctantly, and now sat stiffly on either side of the doorway, ears pinned back, eyes fixed on the woods. The shepherd whined softly, shifting his weight. The mutt growled low in her chest, a quiet, steady sound that felt more like a warning than a reaction. A whistling sound carried on the wind, high and thin, almost like a flute, almost like breath caught in a throat. He turned back into the house. The living room had grown colder. The dogs moved closer to him, their movements slower than usual, as though every step through this house weighed heavier than it should. The living room had grown colder. He rubbed his arms and walked through to the kitchen. No dust there either. The fridge was unplugged but empty, counters bare. A single old cutting board rested by the sink, knife marks deep in the wood, stained dark in places. The shepherd sniffed it, gave a low huff, and walked to his side. The mutt, though, lingered, tilting her head, as if she'd caught a faint scent he couldn't detect. He ran his fingers over the cutting board, unsure why it made his stomach twist. Back through the hallway. The bedroom was the same, a narrow bed with a wool blanket, shelves lined with books whose spines curled outward like bark. A small, outdated radio sat on the nightstand. No TV, no clocks, no mirrors. The shepherd hopped onto the bed without hesitation, curling up in the far corner, as if trying to blend into the shadows. The mutt stayed by the door, her eyes fixed on him, ears twitching at every small sound. The silence stretched. He reached out and turned the radio's dial. Nothing but static. He adjusted the antenna. Still nothing. No voices. No music. Just that hollow rush of sound like wind dragging across bone. He left it on. The bathroom mirror was missing entirely. Just a rectangle of dust where it had hung. The medicine cabinet was filled with worn labels and old brown bottles. A handwritten note was taped to the back of the door, barely legible from water damage. Do not follow the sound. Do not listen too long. Stay above ground. His mouth went dry. He stepped back into the hall. The wind chimes on the porch gave a short metallic clink. Just one note. Then silence. The dogs were no longer barking, but when he looked at them, they hadn't moved, staring right back at him like frightened children. He turned and caught his own reflection faintly in the glass of the front window. His face looked different somehow, not distorted, just off. The shape of his mouth, the slope of his eyes, a fraction of a second behind when he moved. He blinked. The image snapped back into sync. He slept on the couch. The bedroom felt too distant, too curated, like someone else had made the bed and then laid down on top of it just to see how it felt. The couch at least had a dent in the cushions that matched his body, and the dogs had finally settled nearby. They hesitated at first, pacing, then one after the other, they climbed up onto the couch. The shepherd curled tightly against his side. The mutt draped herself across his legs. They pressed close, warm and steady, as if their weight could anchor him in place. He lay under a wool blanket, radio static humming soft in the background like a cracked lullaby. Moonlight stretched through the window slats in pale lines, angling across the floor like prison bars. Somewhere in the dark, the wind chimes stirred. He drifted. The dream came in fragments. First, a hill, bare and earthen, with something buried in it that breathed. The ground pulsed softly, rising with each exhale. A child's voice sang to it, a melody in an old tongue, broken by laughter that didn't sound young. Then, a flute carved of bone. Someone offered it to him, but every time he reached for it, his hands passed through. He could feel the cold of it, even when it vanished. He heard his name, not spoken, but whistled, as if someone had shaped breath into letters without lips. The sound threaded through the air like wire. It was coming from under the floor. He woke just before dawn, mouth dry, hands stiff, static still hissing from the radio. His head throbbed like he'd been listening to something too loud for too long. One of the dogs whined outside. The other growled. Somewhere in the house, beneath the floorboards, something shifted. Not loudly, not even deliberately. Just enough to let him know it was still there. He didn't speak as he dressed, just pulled on his boots and grabbed the flashlight from his pack. The dogs wouldn't come near the door, even when he called. They stayed at the fence, eyes fixed on the house like it was growing teeth. The cellar door was tucked behind the pantry, half hidden behind a sliding shelf lined with canned goods that had long since expired. The frame was warped, the handle wrapped in electrical tape. He had to lean his weight into it just to get it open. It didn't creak, it groaned. The stairs were narrow and steep. Stone walls lined with old insulation and copper wires hung like vines, strung between bent nails. No light switches, no windows, just cold breath rising from the darkness. He descended slowly, flashlight cutting a thin beam ahead of him. The air grew colder, but not musty. Sterile, preserved, like a wound stitched too cleanly. At the base of the steps, the basement opened into a single unfinished room. Concrete floor, thick wooden beams across the ceiling. In the center sat a ring of wind chimes, small and precise, no two alike. Tin, bone, copper, glass. Suspended over a wide glyph burned into the floor. He stopped just outside the ring. The flashlight beam wavered. There was no dust down here either, but not like the rest of the house. This wasn't absence. It was maintenance. Attention. Someone had been here recently. Someone had kept this place quiet. A thick notebook lay open on a table nearby. Beside it, a handmade flute. Wood blackened at the mouthpiece, worn smooth by fingers. He stepped forward. The wind chimes shifted with no breeze. He froze. A breath, not his, fluttered across his ear like a sigh in reverse. He turned. Nothing. Just the chimes moving gently, as if stirred by memory. He stood still, holding the flashlight like a weapon, though his grip had gone slack. The air felt heavier now, not suffocating. Weighted, as if the room had thickened in his presence, measuring him, not watching, listening. The wind chimes had stopped moving. His breath echoed too loudly in the space, bouncing back at him with just enough delay to make it feel borrowed, like he wasn't alone, like someone else was breathing through him. He stepped back, just one pace, and the ring of chimes gave the softest rustle. Not warning, not threat, a note of disappointment. He blinked hard, trying to shake the tightness forming behind his eyes, the kind of pressure you get before a nosebleed or a panic attack. There was a hum in his ears now, faint, vibrating at the edge of recognition, like an electrical frequency that wasn't quite mechanical. Not a sound exactly, more like the memory of one. He looked at the flute again, just sitting there. Blackened mouthpiece, worn wood. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't even especially well made. But there was a curve to it, like it had bent toward a hand that hadn't held it in years. He realized his fingers were twitching. He wanted to pick it up. His mind recoiled, but his hand had already shifted an inch toward it. His body wasn't responding fast enough to what his gut was screaming. The chimes didn't move, but he felt something lean forward, like the entire room had taken an anticipatory breath. He stepped away from the flute, fast this time, knocked his hip against the table, and sent the notebook sliding slightly to the edge. The glyph beneath the chimes caught the light, a circle split by a jagged line, almost like an open mouth. Teeth? No, not teeth. Bars. Something meant to hold sound in. He reached for the notebook slowly this time, careful not to disturb the flute again. The cover was thick leather, soft with age, corners worn. A faint scent of smoke clung to the pages, not fire, but burnt herbs. Inside, the handwriting was clean, sharp, no scrawls or frantic loops, just deliberate script, etched with the kind of focus born from obsession or discipline. April 12th. The chimes hold best when arranged in descending pitch. Copper carries the weight longer than bone. Do not let the wind enter unfiltered. It carries the tone beneath it. He turned the page. April 14th. 3 days without sleep. It wants music, not chaos. It wants to be known. This is not possession. It is residence. It speaks in vibrations, not words. The mind translates what it can. The rest becomes illness. The next page had a drawing, a rough sketch of the glyph on the floor. Notes surrounded it in different inks, like annotations made over years. The mouth is not for eating. It's for release. The song must have form. It must pass through flesh or fade. The piper was the first, but not the only. That name pulled at something in him. The piper, not as a fairy tale, but a pattern, a presence, like he'd heard it somewhere, not in a story, but in a lullaby, on a bus, in a fever dream. Somewhere his mind had hidden it, because it hadn't been safe to remember. The next page was blank, but when he touched it, the hum in his ears grew louder, as if the page wasn't empty, just unfinished. A final line had been scratched deep into the lower margin. The Whistleback is not a name, it's a warning. He stared at the sentence, his skin crawling. Something moved in the chimes again. Not the wind this time, it was breath. He closed the notebook, hands trembling, breath held like he was trying not to disturb the air. He backed away from the table, careful not to cross the glyph or brush against the chimes. Each step felt watched, not in the paranoid sense, but like the room had noticed him now, counted him, filed him under useful. He climbed the stairs with deliberate slowness, not daring to turn his back until he reached the top. He shut the cellar door and leaned against it, heart pounding behind his ribs like something trying to escape. The house was unchanged, still quiet, still clean, still listening. He stood there a long time, forehead against the door, hands braced like a man waiting out an aftershock. But it never came. No voice, no crash, just the same faint pressure in his ears, and the knowledge that something in that basement had measured him and hadn't yet made a decision. He made coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The mug was almost too hot to hold, but he gripped it like an anchor, his eyes fixed on the table. The shepherd rested his chin on his knee, letting out a low, uncertain huff. The mutt was pacing, short, restless loops around the kitchen, as if she wanted to pull him up and lead him away from whatever had sunk its claws into him. He tried to read something, anything normal, an old magazine, a grocery receipt. The mutt pawed at his leg. The shepherd nudged his free hand, both of them casting worried glances between him and the door. By the time he stepped out into the yard, the dogs shadowed him, sticking close, but their alert posture said they weren't just guarding themselves, they were guarding him. The mutt wouldn't stop looking back over her shoulder at him, whining softly. The shepherd brushed against his side every few steps, pressing in as if to steady him. He tried to nap, but the couch felt too hollow. The dogs lay against him like sentries, their breath warm, their bodies tense. He tried to walk the yard's edge, but their pace quickened to match his, flanking him, ears pricked. Even when he stopped and sat on the porch steps, the mutt pressed her nose to his arm while the shepherd leaned against his shoulder. They watched him, not just the shadows in the woods. It didn't work. That night, the wind picked up again. The chimes outside began to sing softly, one note at a time, as if something in the forest were exhaling music into the wind. He sat on the couch, blanket around his shoulders, radio static hissing low beside him like a tired heartbeat. The dogs were at his feet, their heads resting on his legs, their eyes on him, unmoving. Their steady, silent presence was the only thing keeping him grounded. The melody was different now. Not the random ring of metal in wind, but a tune, fractured, old, off-tempo, but deliberate. A child's lullaby, maybe, or a hunting call. And then, buried deep in the static, just beneath the frequency of hearing, he could swear he heard it again. His name. Whistled. He didn't sleep that night. Not really. He closed his eyes. Drifted maybe, but every time he sank beneath the surface of wakefulness, a sound would pull him back. The chimes, the wind, a whistle that felt like it came from inside his own lungs. By dawn, his head throbbed with the kind of ache that pulsed behind the eyes. He found himself humming over coffee. Not a melody he recognized, just a few strange notes, repeating, rising slightly at the end like a question. He only noticed he was doing it when one of the dogs let out a low, uneasy growl from the porch. The shepherd paced the edge of the deck, ears pinned back. The other sat perfectly still, staring at him. He stopped humming. The dog looked away. He didn't go back into the basement. Not that day. He tried walking the woods, sticking to the cleared paths behind the house, the dogs ever by his side. But even there, something was off. Every branch seemed to lean toward him. Every crow call sounded a half-beat too slow. He could feel something under his feet. Not movement exactly, but tension, as if the forest had paused. By afternoon, he was back inside, pacing the living room. He turned the radio off. The silence that followed felt heavier than the static. He thought about calling someone, a friend, a veterinarian, a priest. But what would he say? Hey, something in my basement is breathing through a flute my dead uncle left behind, and it might be trying to wear me like a jacket. Yeah, that would go well. So instead, he sat down with the notebook again. He opened to a page he hadn't read yet. Further in, newer handwriting, less confident. The lines were tighter together, scrawled like someone afraid to let go of the pen. It remembers my voice, even when I don't speak. It plays me in dreams. I wake up whistling, even when my mouth is closed. I think it's lonely, or pretending to be. I can't tell the difference anymore. He flipped to the last page. A single phrase filled the center in capital letters, pressed deep into the paper. If it offers you music, don't listen twice. That night, he didn't turn the radio on. He unplugged it completely and shoved it into the pantry beneath a stack of unopened canned beans. The hum in his ears didn't stop. He read by candlelight. None of the overhead lights worked anymore. Not broken, not burned out. Just dead. The dogs wouldn't come near him now, but they stayed close enough to keep watch. They huddled together in the far corner of the living room, pressed flank to flank, their eyes fixed on him. They moved only to shift their weight, their ears flicking at faint sounds that barely reached his own hearing. They didn't bark, didn't growl. They just stayed there, silent sentinels, waiting for him to tell them everything was fine. When he passed by a mirror, one of the few left in the hallway, he caught his reflection lagging again. Just a heartbeat, just long enough to make him feel watched from within. He covered the mirror with a towel and didn't look back. Sometime after midnight, a sound woke him. Not a crash, not a voice, a note, clear, hollow, drawn out through a long, wet breath. He sat upright on the couch. The wind had died down hours ago. The chimes outside were still, but he could hear the sound again, softer now, closer. Not from outside, not from the basement, from the hallway. He rose, barefoot, holding his breath. The hallway light flickered once and went dark again. But down the corridor, past the bathroom door and the towel-draped mirror, something glinted in the candlelight. Something wet, a trail, beads of moisture, perfectly round, perfectly spaced, as if someone, or something, had been dripping slowly as it moved. It led toward the cellar door. He didn't move closer, didn't call out. He just stood there, eyes locked on that glistening path, heart thudding in his chest like a warning drum. Behind him, the radio, still unplugged, let out one short burst of static, a broken whistle, like a breath caught in someone else's throat. He followed the trail, bare feet on wood, breath held tight, the flashlight cold in his hand. Dogs patrolling around him at a safe distance. The air had changed, warmer somehow, thicker, like walking into a room someone had just left. The droplets glistened in the beam, perfect spheres, unmoving, spaced like punctuation in a sentence he couldn't read. At the cellar door he paused. The handle was warm. He gripped it anyway. It opened without a sound. The descent was slower this time. The chimes below were already moving, softly, erratically, like someone breathing through different lungs with each note. The flashlight flickered as he reached the bottom step. The glyph still burned in the center of the floor. The flute still sat where he'd left it. But something else was there now. A shape, not fully visible, not fully formed. It hung just beyond the chimes, like breath frozen in air, coalescing and collapsing with each faint whistle. Not a body, not a face, just the outline of a presence shaped by the sound. It wasn't moving toward him. It was waiting. His mouth felt dry. He tried to swallow, but his throat wouldn't obey. The journal's final warning echoed in his mind. Don't listen twice. And yet, he had. In the dreams, in the static, in his own breath when he wasn't paying attention. He had listened, again and again, and now he could hear something more. Not just melody, language. The whistles carried meaning, not words but tone, emotion, need. The Whistleback wasn't calling out, it was calling in, and he was already answering. He backed away, not fast, carefully, like a man trying not to startle something sleeping beside him. The flashlight trembled in his hand, beam catching the shimmer of that not-quite shape. The chimes clinked in gentle rhythm, like breath through broken teeth. Another step back, then one more. He reached the stairs, turned, ran. He took the steps 3 at a time, heart slamming, lungs scraping for air that no longer felt clean. The flashlight bounced against the wall, casting long, broken shadows up the narrow shaft. He hit the kitchen floor hard, scrambled forward, slammed the cellar door shut behind him. The dogs were barking again, this time wild, frantic. They clawed at the door, howling like they'd seen something he hadn't. He locked the cellar door, then pushed a chair under the knob, then backed away. But the house didn't change. There was no crash, no scream, no shattering of wood, just the soft, steady whistle from somewhere behind the door. Not loud, not forceful, inviting. He staggered outside. Cold night air hit him like a slap. The sky was clear, full of stars he didn't recognize. Not because they were foreign, but because they felt closer. He made it to the shed. The dogs were circling, whining, pawing at the ground. The mutt looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes, like she already knew he was gone. He slammed the door, bolted it, collapsed against the far wall, breathing fast. No wind, no trees moving. Just that sound. Inside him now. Faint. Constant. A low whistle in the back of his throat, rising with each breath. He clamped a hand over his mouth. Held it in, but the dogs backed into the corner of the shed anyway. And the wind chimes, hanging far across the yard, began to sing on their own. He laid down on the cold earth floor, but he didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every time his eyes drifted, the whistle would rise, louder in his chest, like his own lungs were tuning themselves to another frequency. By dawn, his nose had started bleeding. The dogs still wouldn't look at him. They stayed close, lying at the far edge of the room, ears pinned back and eyes darting toward him in flickering, wary glances. The mutt huffed quietly, and the shepherd shifted his paws, but neither of them moved to leave. They didn't trust what they were seeing, but their loyalty kept them near. He caught them watching him sometimes, not a warm, familiar gaze, but something more searching, as if they were waiting for him to explain what was happening to him. The dogs followed him back into the house. He left some food in their bowls, though neither approached until he turned his back. They ate quickly, nervously, and then returned to their corner. He sat at the table, stared at the keys in his hand, and then rose. They didn't stop him. But as he walked out the door, the shepherd made a low, uncertain sound in his throat. The mutt's ears twitched at the sound of the engine, but neither followed him. He drove. Still in yesterday's clothes, eyes sunken, the whistle humming faintly behind his teeth. The static of the old engine didn't drown it out. He barely noticed the passing village, the hills. On the autobahn he moved as though the miles were a blur, his mind spinning around the same thought. What have I done? The sound didn't fade, it sharpened. And now, when he looked at other drivers, he saw them flinch. A few stared at him like he was leaking something they couldn't name. One child in the back of a passing car started crying the moment they locked eyes. He turned off the highway, tried a motel. 2, actually. The moment he stepped into the lobby of the first, the clerk recoiled. Not visibly, not rudely, just enough to know that something wasn't right. The second wouldn't even let him through the door. "Sorry, we're full," the man lied, eyes never leaving the shadow of the doorway behind him. He drove until sunset, found an empty road pull-off by a lake, sat on the hood of the truck and watched the last of the light bleed across the water. He didn't feel tired anymore. He didn't feel anything. Only the sound. Now a song. Now his song. He sat by the lake until the stars came out. He thought about drowning. Not poetically, logistically. The water was deep, cold, remote. If he filled his pockets with stones and walked in slowly enough, maybe the weight would drag the sound down with him. Maybe water could mute the melody. He stood, took a few steps toward the bank, stopped. The whistling grew louder, not frantic, not angry, concerned, like it feared being alone again. His knees buckled. He dropped to the gravel, gasping, hands over his ears. But the sound wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was behind his tongue, beneath his ribs, every breath a low, rising hum he couldn't suppress. He stumbled back to the truck, sat in the driver's seat, shaking. Reached into the glove box and pulled out the old tape recorder his uncle used to carry everywhere. Field notes, bird calls, wind patterns. He remembered him sitting on the back porch, recording nothing but silence for hours. said he was trying to find the shape of things that don't want to be seen. He hit record, pressed the mic to his lips, and whistled. The sound came out clean, whole, not from his throat but from somewhere deeper. Something responded, not in the recorder, not in the air, in him. A second whistle, higher, layered beneath his own. The harmony clicked like a key in a lock, and suddenly, he knew the next note. He knew the whole song. He threw the recorder into the lake, watched it sink, bubbles rising like ghosts. The whistling stopped for a moment. The silence that followed was worse. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like a lover turning their face away in disappointment. He returned to the house just before dawn. The sun hadn't crested the hills yet, but the sky was bruising with light. The dogs were there. As he pulled into the driveway, their ears perked up, tails wagging. They bounded toward him, their excitement palpable, sniffing his boots, nudging his legs, as though everything was back to normal. But then their enthusiasm faltered. The mutt froze first, tilting her head, then back to step, her tail slowing. The shepherd's wagging stopped altogether, his ears flattening against his head. They exchanged a glance, almost as if they were trying to confirm with each other what they were sensing. They stayed nearby, circling him in slow, measured steps, alert but hesitant. They didn't leave him. They never left. But the joy they'd shown just moments before was gone, replaced by that quiet, watchful tension. They walked inside with him, careful not to stray too close, watching him as though he were a stranger they still wanted to protect. The glyph in the basement pulsed faintly now, lit from within like coals beneath ash. The wind chimes turned slowly without breeze, catching just enough movement to whisper. The flute waited in the center. At the top of the stairs, the dogs stood side by side, heads low, their ears pinned back. The shepherd whined softly, his tail flicking once, uncertain. The mutt shifted her weight, pressing close to her companion, as though silently asking what to do. Neither came any closer. They just stood there, watching him descend, their eyes filled with something deeper than fear, a quiet, terrible understanding. This might be the moment he slipped away from them forever. He stepped past the edge of the containment ring, felt the shift immediately. His breath synced with something else's, like breathing in harmony with a second set of lungs. He picked up the flute. It was warm, not from the room, from recognition. He raised it to his lips, fingers curled around the carved grooves like they'd never forgotten the shape. He played the first note. Pain lanced through his teeth, into his jaw, down his spine. Not physical, not nerve deep. This was identity peeling away. He felt his name slip loose from him, like a jacket shrugged off in fog. Another note. Memories shattered like glass on stone, birthdays, voices, warmth, all sifted out. A third. The glyph flared. The chimes wailed once, then fell silent. And with the final breath, the melody completed itself. He didn't fall. He didn't scream. He simply ceased to be a man with a name, and became a structure, a vessel, the new walls of the cage. The house grew still. The wind outside softened. The chimes settled. The air reset itself like breath held after a scream. Below the floorboards, the presence coiled inward, sated, anchored, not banished, never banished, just cradled again in flesh and will. At the top of the basement stairs, the dogs lay silent and still, their bodies slack against the cold wood. Their fur was matted at the ears, dark streaks trailing down their necks, as though the sound had poured through them, leaving them emptied. There were no paw shifts, no quiet whines, only an unnatural stillness, the kind that spoke of something having reached too far and taken too much, and the man who had come to inherit the house. He was still there, but not in any way the world would recognize. The next time someone crossed the threshold, they wouldn't hear footsteps. They'd pause, unsettled, unsure why the walls felt closer than they should. And if they listened, really listened, they'd hear a low, rising whistle, almost imperceptible, drifting from the corners of the room, as if the house itself were quietly exhaling. Thanks for taking the time to listen to Whistleback. What did you think of the story? Was it the unnerving silence of the house that stayed with you, or the connection between the man and the dogs? I'd love to hear your thoughts and theories. Drop a comment below and let's discuss what really happened beneath those floorboards. If you enjoyed the tale, consider giving this video a like, sharing it with a friend, and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps bring more stories to life. Make sure to hit the notification bell so you'll know when the next Eerie chapter drops. Until then, have a great day, stay curious, and I'll see you next time.